You're listening to Liberty Buzzard with Dustin Hammett and Thomas Umstattd Jr.
Episode 12.
I'm Dustin Hammett.
I'm Thomas Umstattd Jr.
And today we're going to be discussing social media and does it reflect real life? So Thomas and I, off the air yesterday, were discussing a little bit, and we want to discuss it on the show today, about our experiences with social media and how we both noticed a trend of it becoming more and more disparate and polarized. And we want to discuss today on the show with each other whether we thought social media, and we're going to go ahead and name Twitter and Facebook, those being my two old man social media references, are they a distillation of magnification of people's true thoughts? Or is it just a subset and humanity is still humanity, and it's just the vicious, polarized nature of social media becoming more vicious? So we're going to discuss that first. Then we're going to discuss a little bit about an interesting election that happened yesterday. It may or may not be couched in our discussion of social media and politics. So first things first, social media. Thomas, what do you think about that?
I just have one word for you, Justin. Harambe.
Free Kekistan.
So for those of you who don't know, Harambe was a gorilla that kidnapped a small child at the zoo, and the zookeepers had to shoot the gorilla and kill it to keep the child safe. And normal world reacted for about 6 hours to this news event. Social media world reacted for months. There were memes and memorials, and it just seemed completely disproportionate for what happened. And death threats to the mom of the child for being a murderer because she let her child get loose. And I don't know. I feel like there isn't social media. There are social medias, and you kind of find the bubble that you are most comfortable with, where what is being reflected to you is your perception of reality. And that's done two different ways. In Facebook, it's done algorithmically, where what you see on Facebook is a mirror of yourself because of the algorithm. So if you're white middle class, you see lots of white middle class things, and the people that you see are very similar to you. Whereas with Reddit, it's by topic. And you get to pick yourself kind of what bubble you want to be in. And what's at least nice about Reddit, which, by the way, is more popular than Twitter in terms of monthly active users. So it's not really Facebook and Twitter anymore. It's Facebook and Reddit. You can go and check out other people's bubbles at least. Whereas with Facebook, you're completely insulated from any kind of opinion that doesn't agree with you unless it's being held by one of your close friends. And I don't feel that social media reflects real life. I wish I spent less time on social media personally, but it's like a drug, it's like cigarettes were in the early 1900s. We kind of know how dangerous it is and like how unhealthy it is, but we don't really know. And it's just kind of a dirty habit right now. Later, I think it'll be seen as something much more sinister.
I don't disagree with you on that one. Social media by its very nature, it manipulates the very basest of our instincts. So whether it's food, the need for water, the drive for sex and procreation, or our very basic nature related to the sexual drive, which is our desire to be a part of a group, because we are social animals at our very most basic form. So in terms of social media being an addiction, it's playing very, very, very deep to our limbic system, to our animal brains. So not to get too far off the tracks there, but I definitely agree with you on that one. There's times where I have to force myself to put it down because it's so consuming. What an enormous waste of time, but it's so consuming, and you just want to get back to it. And you hear that it's like a Pavlovian response. You hear that little ding, and you just can't help yourself. I got in trouble with my wife the other day because she was talking to me, and I heard a ding, and my Pavlovian response forced me beyond my will to grab the cell phone and look at it. And woo-wee, was she mad at me. And I just couldn't help myself. It was absolutely amazing.
You
But-
are the master of your fate, Justin. You
I
are
wasn't.
the captain of your ship. You are responsible for the decisions that you make in life.
I was an oppressed
you can't
victim
blame
of my own
Pavlov.
humanity.
You are not a dog slurping at the sound of a bell. You are a man.
That could be argued.
Yeah, it is interesting how there is some truth though in what you say, in the sense that it is designed to trigger dopamine responses. The reaction can be very much drug-like, and studies do show that people who spend time on social media are sadder, more depressed, and have less good real life interactions. And the more they spend on social media, the sadder they get, especially when they're scrolling and consuming. So you have people who create and people who consume. In general, the creators are happier. So kind of at the top of the pyramid are like your bloggers and your podcasters and people who are creating, and your artists, like who are creating the art. Those are the people that are the happiest. And then there's the people who are kind of just scrolling past thing after thing after thing. And those are the people who are the least happy. And so, just keep that in mind, that it does help if you want to have your voice as a part of the conversation. That will help you enjoy social media more.
Well, that's an interesting point. So I guess that brings us back around full circle to what we were originally discussing is, I have two thoughts. I haven't reached a definitive conclusion. I might not ever. But I have one thought which says that there are very few people in our society today, and we have a global society, no doubt. Social media has made the world much smaller, but we also have our basic community, the people around us, the people at work, the people, our neighborhoods, and then we have the American, state community, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't think there's very many people out there today that are in some way, form, or fashion not connected to some type of social media. So I wondered to myself as I scroll through the old Twitter feed in the afternoon when I'm taking a break from real life, I'm wondering to myself, is the polarization of our nation, that rhymes, the polarization of our nation, is it the result of social media? Is it a symptom of social media? Is it really even truly a thing? Or is it just a confirmation bias because we see it every day, because you and I are on social media, that we think the world is becoming more polarized? So another way to say, if somebody who is not on social media, do they think the world is as polarized as it is right now?
Well, I do feel like social media influences the discussion outside of social media. So if you turn on cable news, the conversation from social media often will get onto cable news. I do think, though, that if you avoid the news and you're not on social media, it has no impact at all. And I have friends who do this. They don't listen to the news or watch the news, and they're not on social media. And they have such better lives. Like there's a level of contentment that they have that I really kind of envy, which is really cool, which, I realize is a bit disserving, right? Because we have a podcast about the news and we want you to share it on social media.
Yeah, please share our podcast.
Yeah, please tweet and Facebook about this podcast and spread the word. But there is a truth that, if you can't change something, why should you know about it? And how much of the news is something that actually affects you? So a lot of people are really invested in Trump related news, either because they hate Trump passionately. I have a friend who hates Trump to the core of his being and can't acknowledge that Trump has done a single good thing, and is afraid of him and is concerned that he's destroying the country. And he spends at least an hour every day following exactly what Trump is doing.
I think the world would call that Trump derangement syndrome.
And I'm like, okay, this is making you miserable. There's nothing you can do about Trump. Like, the election for Trump isn't for a long time, and you're in a state that is not going to vote for him under any circumstances. And so don't worry about it. This is something that literally you have no effect on. And yet this is 7 hours a week that are being devoted to studying what Trump is doing. On the other hand, I know people who are hardcore Trump fans, and every time he is attacked, they feel as if they are attacked, and they feel like they need to defend him. And it's like, you can't change anything. The reality is that there's only a handful of states that really influence presidential elections where your vote really matters. Like if you're in Florida, your vote really matters. If you're in Texas, it really doesn't. It's like, we're going to go for the Republican. Say what?
It's sad to say, but it's true.
Yeah. So the way that the electoral system works, each state's votes go in a lump, which is one of the reasons why Democrats are losing right now. It's because they're all flocking to California, where their additional votes don't count. If the extra Democrats in California were to spread around the country and move to places like Montana and Wyoming, suddenly the electoral college would be totally different.
True, but they don't want to move there.
They don't. They like to live in urban centers.
Restaurants.
Yeah. Democrats, it is interesting, really do prefer cities. They like to be around other people who are like-minded in very dense urban settings. And they're not, while they glamorize kind of nature, they don't, and they like to visit, they don't like to stay. They don't want to actually live far away from urban populations.
The ideal of nature versus the reality.
Which I will say, I'm there. Yeah, I'm there, right? I like my fast internet and my short commute. I wouldn't want a suburban lifestyle where everything is a million miles away. So it may sound like I'm throwing shade, but I'm the city person on this podcast. Dustin's the guy who lives in the middle of nowhere, where his internet has to come by little elves that like carry it across the ground and hope that it works every day.
I absolutely love it. And there's bugs and there's snakes and there's all kinds of things that city people hate, and I just love it out here.
Speaking of snakes, I hear that you're considering communism. Is this true? You're reading the Communist Manifesto? Thomas
and his fake news. So I am not reading the Communist Manifesto yet. I just got done reading Saul Alinsky's Rules for Radicals, which is a book by Saul Alinsky, who was a big communist community organizer type of individual back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And he was a communist by ideology, a Marxist by ideology. And he wrote this book about how to get your way, how to use the have-not mob, how to mobilize the have-not mob, how to congeal them, and how to put them into an effective fighting force for your desires, for your end political goals. It's a fascinating book. I mean, it's interesting when you find yourself agreeing on certain topics with somebody that's a known communist, which is, as an ideal, I understand communism, but as a reality, I deplore it. And I think I'm getting sidetracked here. But so what I mentioned to Thomas earlier, dear listener, was that I had to go back and reread the Communist Manifesto. I had read it previously back in college, which was a few years ago now, and I didn't appreciate it then because all I wanted to do was read it so I could get answers for the test. And now I'm going to read it to get a better appreciation for what Marxism truly is, because we have seen a resurgence in Marxism. And going back to the social media theme, Thomas, I think this is really related to whether it's a derivative of a social media or just a derivative of our times. Trump was a pendulum swing to the right of Obama by the hardcore right. And I think what you're going to see is the Bernie left pendulum swing as a reaction to Donald Trump. And I'm wondering how far exactly the pendulum is going to keep swinging before things either calm down or get out of control. And so my point to all this is that in New York, last night, we have a 28-year-old, I can't say for sure she's a socialist, but she is endorsed by the American Democratic Socialist Party of America and a lot of socialist Marxist type organizations. And she's a Bernie Sanders type politician. So I'm going to assume that she's a socialist. Her name is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. And she unseated Joe Crowley in a New York primary for the House of Representatives, which is notable because Joe Crowley has been in office for gosh, I can't even find it here, a long, long time. So I think what you're seeing, Thomas, is you are seeing the pendulum swing farther to the left as a response of the left to Bernie, to Donald Trump. So like your friend who can't stand Trump, he or she may have been in the middle initially, but is now swinging hard left. And I've seen it on the right too. People who were centrist but leaned right are now feeling defensive and are retreating to the defensive lines of Donald Trump. And it's getting very, very polar. Interesting, and also a little bit scary. What do you think?
Is this really a left-right thing, or is it a corporation, not corporation thing? Let me explain what I mean. So, sure, this guy was more centrist on paper, this hardcore Democrat who's been a Democrat for a long time. Although, I imagine on the actual issues, if you were to put them on a voter guide, it wouldn't be that different. The difference between a hardcore Democrat and a, really kind of just regular Democrat don't seem that different to me. Maybe to people who are more in that camp, zebras can tell each other apart. But I think the bigger difference is that he's been in office for a long time, which means he's been getting lots and lots of lobby money for a long time. And he's more in bed with the people who are donating money to him than he is with his actual voters. And I think that's actually the bigger issue. And that's what we saw with Trump and Clinton. Clinton was very much in bed with the people who were giving her money, even when it didn't make sense for her ideology. She would make compromises on her ideology and, give a speech for Goldman Sachs, right? A good Democrat doesn't take money from big banks, right? That undermines your ideology. And yet she was doing that. And I suspect the same with this guy, where it wasn't that he didn't check the right boxes. We have the same problem on the right. Right. These people who've been in office for a long time, they check the box of, yes, I want to support the troops. Yes, I'm pro-life, all the kind of classic Republic, yes, small government. But when you look at what they're actually doing, it often doesn't line up with those boxes that they check on a voter guide. It lines up with the people who are giving them money, where they're wanting to regulate things. The biggest thing is creating regulations that benefit big business. And Republicans do it and Democrats do it. That's the biggest thing from my perspective. The left actually wants more regulations because in their worldview, regulations hurt big business, often because they've never actually worked for a big company and they don't understand how regulations are so beneficial at pushing away competition and making life for big businesses easier. But I get that. And what's interesting is it used to be whoever has the most money wins. Is a general rule. There's a strong correlation between spending more money and getting more votes. Trump spent far less money than Hillary overall and spent way less money per vote. I think he spent like $2 less per vote than Hillary did. Like it was a significant amount less. And what we're finding is that you can't buy your way into elections like you used to, partly because I think of the internet and so many news sources that people are able to get the truth from, and the fact that I think there's a bias. I'm definitely this way. If I get more mail from somebody, I'm less likely to vote for them because I know that they're getting the money for those mail pieces from lobbyists, from corporations that don't have my interests at heart. They have their own interests at heart. And corporations, publicly traded ones, tend to be sociopaths in the sense that they don't, as a corporation, have a conscience. They are, everyone it's disintermediated leadership. Right. They have a board of directors that are appointed by other corporations whose boards are directed by other corporations. And there's no personality. There's no human with a reputation at the top. And they don't tend to be loving and compassionate. Companies can be that way. Typically, if they're owned by a family, if they're owned by a single person whose reputation is on the line, they're absolutely that way. But the publicly traded ones don't tend to be that way. And when they start influencing policy, it can get very scary.
That's interesting. Interesting way to phrase it. Corporate sociopathy. I agree with you 100% on that one. Corporate sociopathy. One of the things I tell people is be careful who you give your loyalty to. For those who don't know out there, I have been a United States Marine. Was active duty for about 6 years and still a reservist. Marines are indoctrinated indoctrinated from the very beginning to give their loyalty to the Marine Corps. And one of the things I've learned over the years is, while I'm very proud to be a Marine, is that the Marine Corps as an entity is made up of a large group of people who, by and large, don't care about the individual. They will chew you up and spit you out like bubblegum without a second thought. You give your loyalty to individuals, which is why I'm such a big fan of smaller businesses. That said, large businesses do employ a lot of people, and people hate large businesses until they go out of business, and those people don't have jobs anymore, and those people often become very sad very quick. So, I agree with you that there's a lot there. Having corporations as legal entities in the political process is very scary. Now, whether the reaction, whether that vote last night in New York or the vote for Donald Trump, almost 2 years ago now, is a reaction against corporate money? I think that's a part of it. Is it a reaction against the Citizens United Supreme Court decision? I think it's a part of it, but I don't think it's the entirety of it. I think it may have formed the basis. It may have been the garden bed, but I think it's gone beyond that now. You look at the central issues today, like the one we discussed yesterday, which is immigration. You have the left view, you have the right view, or the Supreme Court decision that upholding President Trump's travel ban. You have the left view and the right view, and you have these two disparate camps. And a lot of times, the centrists, what I've noticed, once again on social media, I'm still out to lunch on whether this reflects real life or if it's just a social media thing. You'll have the centrist try to promote a centrist view, and they will just get torn apart by the polls. So there's no happy spot for the centrists who are just trying to rationalize and be reasonable, because they get torn apart by the polls. And so the natural reaction of a social human being is to, you got to pick a camp. You cannot. It's really scary to be out there alone and unafraid by yourself. It's a very, very conscious, mentally painful thing for a human being to be alone. So you force these people into camps. There was one tweet I saw yesterday from someone who is fairly centrist, but leans right. And that person, this is kind of what made me start thinking about it, made the comment that it seems like the United States of America is turning into a party not of liberals and conservatives, not of Republicans and Democrats, not of the left versus right, but of socialists versus Trumpists. And Bernie-type socialists versus Trumpists. And she made the mention, and she did not vote for Trump in the past election, that if she had to choose between the two, how did she phrase it? I'll go with the Trumpy GOP all day long over Marxism. And I agree with her. And if I have to go one or the other, I'm in that same boat. So this, I think we're circling back around to the original question, which was, does social media, which I have been beaten on this whole podcast, does it reflect society? And I'm going to bring this around. I want to discuss more, Thomas, your friends who are not at all on social media or watch the news. Have you talked to them about politics, and what do they think about politics in our nation today?
Yeah, so what we need are radical moderates. What we often have are quiet moderates who are moderate in their political opinions and moderate in their volume. And so you have the left, which is really loud, and the right, which is really loud, and the moderates are not being loud. They're and often people in the middle are just kind of trying to kind of average out the extremes rather than actually having a position that is a true kind of centrist path. They're like, no, this is actually what I believe in. It's kind of a centrist collection of views. So this one friend I'm thinking of, she has libertarian-ish views, but I don't know if she votes anymore. I think her big thing is like conscious apathy, where she's choosing not to know and not to care and just to live a happy life and not worry about politics. I don't think I could ever do that. I think I care too much. I care about the direction the country's going in, even if it does make me sadder to try to be involved and try to be a voice. Right. Like I totally agree with her position that she's a happier person not following this. But I'm willing to potentially sacrifice some happiness. And that's kind of what I want this show to be. At least I feel like I'm a radical moderate in the sense that I am not a hardcore right-wing person or a hardcore left-wing person, but I do hold my opinions pretty strongly. So, I think that both sides need to be held to account, so to speak, and by their own people. And they're not doing that. Like when the right is being disingenuous and is lying, you don't hear people on the right calling them out on it. And when the left is being crazy town, you don't hear people on the left calling them out on it. There's this whole like, oh, well, you just protect your own, don't criticize another Republican. And I feel like in the long run, the winning strategy is to have the party and have the ideology that's the cleaner party and the cleaner ideology, the one that's more free of corruption, more free of liars and people who are trying to deceive, and is more honest and transparent and clear. And I think that long term, that is what the electorate is wanting. In the short term, tricks work, but I don't think it works in the long term. And I think that's what we're seeing with this election in New York.
Well, and it's interesting because even old Saul Alinsky in his Rules for Radicals mentions specifically that a political tactic that is a drag, which is I interpret it as being very negative in nature, will eventually become a drag and people will abandon it. So I wonder if I've already seen from what I would consider fairly level-headed people the mention of a soft civil war. I've seen those type of mentions out there in the internet, and I can't remember my original point. Oh yeah, my original point that I'm trying to get to before my brain sidetracked me was I have actually seen, Thomas, a rise of a radical moderate. And the point I want to make to you is a spectrum of the spectrum of politics as I have seen it, watching it and reading it over the years. Is back in the old days of Rush Limbaugh, you had the liberals and the conservatives, and liberals was a dirty word to conservative, and conservative was a dirty word to a liberal. Well, I think the pendulum has swung so far to the left and right on the political spectrum where now you have progressives, which are different from liberals, because a lot of the liberal intellectuals that I've been listening to are actively trying to distance themselves from this move called progressivism, which is fast becoming synonymous with socialism and Marxism. And then same thing on the right, where you have people like Ben Shapiro, who are tepid supporters of Trump, but are not afraid to voice their opposition of Trump. And he does that at significant risk of being torn down by the polls. And it happened just the other day, and I can't remember what the issue was about. But he made a statement that was not supportive of the president, and he got torn apart and called a cuck by the Trump crowd for not supporting the president. So I think you have on the right, you have the MAGA Trump crowd, which is kind of far to the right. On the left, you have the Bernie socialist crowd, which is kind of far to the left. And all of a sudden, an interesting point, all of a sudden, now the definition of a liberal is more, and as I see it, has become more centrist. A liberal is no longer far left. A liberal is now center left. And a conservative or a neocon, what have you, is now center right. And I will point to you the examples of the intellectuals I follow. I consider them intellectuals. People like Dave Rubin on the left, or people like Ben Shapiro on the right, who are now, for all intents and purposes, more moderate than the extremes of their own party identifications, of their own wings. So I do think you have I think you have a vocal, moderate population building steam. I would like to consider myself one of those. People who are, quote unquote, free speech absolutists. And the liberals will say, yeah, it's okay for a baker to deny someone who wants to bake an LGBT cake. And at the same time, people on the right who will say, yeah, it's absolutely the Red Hen owner's right to deny service to a political ideology that she doesn't like. It's their right. That's something it's part of a freedom of speech and part of a freedom of business that we in the United States represent. So you have these two people agreeing on fundamentally the same issue, which is freedom of speech, freedom of expression, but they're opposite sides of the left and right. And I think that's the moderate center that you're striving for, and it's building steam.
Let's hope. And, because I don't think that supporting the Constitution and the principles of the Bill of Rights is, a radical position, although it seems radical right now. And it is true that we go through seasons where politics is more polarized and politics is more unified. The primary unifying force in politics is to have a popular war with an external threat. So being being invaded is incredibly powerful for unifying disparate factions. And the best example of this is from ancient Greece. You have Sparta and you have Athens, and these people hate each other. They're constantly at war. When a Spartan finds an Athenian, they'll kill each other, all things being equal. But then they get invaded by Persia, and they're like, yeah, maybe we should team up. So, hey, Athenians, exactly. You're really good at boats. Why don't you all fight the Persians at sea? And Spartans, we're really good at like fighting on the ground, and we have really good soldiers. So maybe we'll fight the Persians on land. And the invasion of the Persians ultimately brought the Greeks together for a short time. And we saw that with World War II. And during the Cold War, really, the entirety of the Cold War, there was this bipartisan consensus on foreign policy, where Democrats and Republicans really did not disagree on foreign policy. And I remember in the presidential debates, the foreign policy segment was always so boring because there was no real difference, and yet they still had to debate. And so the big debate, and they would talk for 5 minutes about bilateral or multilateral discussions with North Korea. And that was the nuanced difference, that one party believed in multilateral talks and the other one wanted bilateral talks. Or maybe it was how many members in the multilateral talks, right? Should you include China or not? And I was like, man, that is a really minor disagreement. It's like, that is really in the weeds. And that's like what you're fighting over. Whereas Trump now represents a totally fundamentally different shift in foreign policy, where he's like, we should not be a part of these big alliances. We should not work with the community as a whole. We need to make agreements with each country individually. So he doesn't want these big associations. Instead, he wants to make deals with England specifically, not with the EU, with Germany specifically, not the EU, and with, not a trans-Pacific trade partnership, but a deal specifically with China. And that's a big shift. Like, that's something that we haven't seen in a very, very long time, which is an actually different view of foreign policy. So it'll be interesting to see how it plays out as we have swung to the polls. And it is interesting, as the right has gotten more right. If the Democrats would have just stayed in the middle, I think they could very easily have won if they could have found an honest middle. But the problem is right now the middle is the bought and paid for. It's the radicals who are often the more honest. We've got to find those radical centrists if you want to find a path forward.
Well, I have a book for you if you do. It's called Rules for Radicals by Saul Alinsky. And while I don't necessarily agree with socialism and communism, the man makes a lot of good points about how to mobilize a political base. And it's actually a really good book. I recommend anybody who's interested in politics and power politics to read it. I'll go read the Communist Manifesto again, Thomas, because I think it's Sun Tzu that said, know your enemy. And while I won't necessarily say enemy, because an enemy is someone generally that you want to kill and defeat, I'll say opponent as a softer word, as a part of my radical moderation.
You're going to start growing that ponytail. You're going to start smoking that marijuana. You're going to start wearing tie-dye. I can see it now. Former Marine.
I doubt it.
Well, we want to hear what you think. Feel free to drop us a line. You can reach us at libertybuzzard.com. Leave a comment on this show. This is episode 12. I've been Thomas Umstattd.
I'm Dustin Hammett.
And thank you for listening to Liberty Buzzard.